From the moment Japan set foot in China in the 1930s, it committed countless atrocities. From Nanjing to Wuhan, from monstrous medical experiments to the infamous comfort women, the Chinese endured terrible crimes that still shape relations between their countries today. However, there was one policy that caused more death and suffering than any other, one that is largely unknown in the West, one that the Chinese would give a simple descriptive name: the 3 alls. Loot all, burn all, kill all. Today, on A Day in History, we'll look at where this policy came from and what it meant for its millions of victims. The Second Sino-Japanese War began in 1937 and dovetailed into the wider Second World War. Throughout these conflicts, Japan was known for its excessive brutality, delivered to civilians and soldiers alike of all nations. A Japanese military immersed in ideas of its racial superiority, taught to despise so-called weakness in enemies and non-combatants, and raised to give complete obedience to their superiors inevitably led to horrors for its enemies. China knew this better than anyone else. The Japanese had been committing massacres and abuses across China from 1937. Tianjin, Beijing, and Shanghai, for example, saw all manner of crimes. Of course, nothing compares to the 6 weeks of horror unleashed on Nanjing, starting in December 1937, which left hundreds of thousands dead or raped. Into 1938, the Japanese continued this pattern of war crimes. For example, during the Battle of Wuhan, the Japanese authorized hundreds, if not thousands, of gas attacks, often on civilians as they fought to capture the city from the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek. However, while the nationalists were the main threat in China, Japan also had to deal with another problem: communists. It was the struggle of dealing with the communist guerrillas of Mao Zedong in northern China that would lead to the 3 alls policy. Starting in 1938, the Japanese North China Area Army was assigned to contain the communists in the countryside there, while the bulk of Japanese military attention remained on the nationalists. Emperor Hirohito personally signed off on orders to pacify these northern provinces, which gave the soldiers a complete free hand to do whatever they deemed necessary. Orders like this make it hard to draw a clear line between the official 3 alls policy that would come later, and what Japan was already doing in China for years before that. Following these orders, the Japanese occupation forces were given permission to loot, burn, and kill anything and anyone in their mission to defeat the communists. They used violence to intimidate villagers accused of helping communists, massacred alleged communist sympathizers, burned homes and villages to stop them helping the guerrillas, and sowed a climate of fear and despair in communist-controlled areas. According to one story, the desperate residents of one village in Hebei province dug a tunnel system to hide from the Japanese during this period of pacification. When the Japanese found out, they tried to flush them out by lighting pigs on fire and releasing them into the tunnels to terrify and burn out the occupants. When that didn't work, one Japanese officer allegedly had the idea of starving them out. He ordered gramophones to be set up to play the sounds of trucks and marching troops, to trick the Chinese into thinking it wasn't safe to come out. That way, the Chinese would be forced to stay hidden until they starved or gave up and came out themselves. It didn't work, but it showed the lengths the Chinese went to try to escape their occupiers, and the sorts of things the occupiers were willing to do to stamp them out. Despite this harsh policy, the communist guerrillas were a secondary concern for the Japanese, compared to the nationalists throughout 1938 and 39. That changed in August 1940, when the communists launched their largest offensive ever. Across northern China, an estimated 400,000 communist fighters participated in an assault known as the 100 Regiments Offensive. Simultaneously, the guerrillas struck out at Japanese bases, railway lines, coal mines, bridges, and just about anything that might be strategically valuable. The Japanese were taken completely by surprise, and the communists enjoyed remarkable success until October. By that point, the Japanese had managed to organize an effective response and began to push back the communists, but not before losing around 20,000 soldiers, vast amounts of supplies, numerous key installations, and over 600 miles of railway. The 100 Regiments Offensive ended by December 1940, and the Japanese were furious. Major General Ryukichi Tanaka vowed to deliver retribution to the guerrillas, so he drew up a new strategy which he called the burn to ash approach. This was scorched earth at its most extreme. Anything the Japanese could not control would be destroyed to prevent it falling into communist hands. This included anything from food to people to entire villages. It also authorized the elimination of, quote, enemies pretending to be local people, and all males between the ages of 15 and 60 whom we suspect to be enemies. The communists soon gave it its nickname of the Three Alls: loot all, burn all, kill all. This was the official start of the Three Alls policy, but it was little more than a new expression of what the Japanese had already been doing. The policy was put into full effect in 1941 by General Yasuji Okamura. With direct endorsement from Emperor Hirohito himself, Okamura was given full operational control of the North China Area Army, which he would use to systematically destroy the communists across the provinces. Okamura divided the provinces into three categories. The pacified provinces were secure, the unpacified ones wholly in command of the communists, and the semi-pacified ones were contested. Okamura would use a combination of containment and catastrophic violence to pacify all of them. Okamura ordered hundreds of miles of trenches and fortifications to be built to contain the communists within these provinces. These fortifications were supposed to, quote, strengthen the containment of the enemy and destroy his will to continue fighting. All of these fortifications were built by forced Chinese labor, mostly men between the ages of 17 and 40 taken from the surrounding villages. Tens of thousands of them would be worked to death by their uncompromising and unsympathetic Japanese occupiers. Identifying and containing the unpacified provinces was only the beginning. Next came actually pacifying them. Loot, burn, and kill was a very literal expression of how the Japanese did this. Japanese soldiers entering a village suspected of communist sympathies would steal food, clothes, fuel, and anything else that might be useful. In some cases, even the houses would be torn down and used as firewood. This worked in two ways: denying these things to the communists while supplying the Japanese with what they needed. Particularly troublesome villages were often burned wholesale. If they were lucky, the residents would flee at the first sight of the Japanese. Those who couldn't flee had a grim fate. In one village, in Hebei for example, 60 people were piled into a house before the Japanese burned them alive. Fighting-age men were usually killed on the spot, unless they were needed for forced labor. Women and girls suffered horrific sexual abuse, and many who fell into Japanese hands thanks to the Three Alls policy would join the ranks of the infamous comfort women. In other cases, the Japanese resettled the villages in new collective hamlets, which could be more easily monitored. The Japanese also developed ways to control villages without destroying them. So-called puppet Chinese, those willing to collaborate with the Japanese, could be installed in a village to keep it secure. The Japanese also employed spies to monitor suspect populations that, for one reason or another, weren't simply killed. One former Japanese officer recalled paying spies with opium in exchange for information in occupied territory. These spies and puppet Chinese held the power of life or death over their countrymen, and just one word of accusation against them to the Japanese could have them before a firing squad. But the villages that were looted or relocated were the luckier ones. The guerrilla nature of the communist resistance meant that they could easily hide among the population. To the Japanese, this made anyone a potential enemy and a legitimate target. A soldier named Tominaga Shozo reflected on the attitude he and other Japanese had at that time. Massacres of civilians were routine. They cooperated with the enemy, sheltered them in their houses, and gave them information. We viewed them as the enemy. Collective punishment of whole villages for alleged communist sympathies was widespread. One Japanese colonel operating near an alleged pro-communist village wrote in his diary, "The communists give me a headache. Around here, even the women join the war and throw grenades. I have received orders from my superior officer that every person in this place must be killed." The Three Alls policy led to hundreds, if not thousands, of massacres across northern China, as the Japanese took out their anger at the guerrillas on the civilian population. Post-war legal and historical investigations dug up seemingly endless lists of horrendous actions. 400 families massacred together in Xiang Kuochang village in 1943. 128 women and children stabbed or buried alive in Chuan Tuanseng, and so on. Uno Shintaro was one of the Japanese officers operating in northern China at the height of the Three Alls policy. Speaking to historians decades after the war, he recalled one typical experience of massacring villages. He was ordered by his superiors to secure a nearby village that was alleged to have communist sympathizers. Shintaro sent a squad in to round up the mayor and 8 other leading village figures. They were taken back to the Japanese camp, where they were tortured for information about their alleged communist allies. Shintaro remembered feeling an intense hatred for them. He'd known Japanese soldiers killed by the guerrillas, but he confessed that no matter how many communists or alleged communists he killed, it did not, quote, even the score. Eventually, Shintaro realized he would get nothing useful from them, so he beheaded the prisoners with his own officer's sword. He had some of his Chinese prisoners dig a grave for the bodies and bury them. "We told them not to look," he said, "but in a sense, it was better for us if they did. They would realize that if they got out of line, they too might be in danger." Japanese soldiers were taught to be utterly desensitized to this violence. When Tominaga Shozo first arrived in China, he recalled his commanding officer ordering all of his men to assemble one morning. 24 Chinese prisoners had been lined up for them. The officer drew his sword and told his men, "Heads should be cut off like this," before giving them a bloody demonstration. Shozo and the rest of the soldiers were then ordered to practice it themselves. Shozo claimed he was disgusted at the time, but that didn't stop him from marching out, drawing his sword, and obeying his orders. This so-called kill drill desensitized recruits to death and showed the utter lack of value that Chinese lives were given by the Japanese forces. It is unknown how many villages were wiped out by this policy, but it was certainly in the hundreds, if not the thousands. There are no detailed records, no clear accounting, not even a census to chart more than a fraction of what occurred in northern China in these years. We can only see glimpses, like that given by one British journalist who visited the region in 1945. "I visited towns and cities and villages. Some of them completely destroyed and flattened. Villages without a living thing, not a living person, not an animal or beast, nothing left. Just the hand of death of the villages." The Three Alls policy proved quite successful in dealing with the communists. By the end of 1942, the communists admitted to losing around 200,000 fighters to death, imprisonment, or desertion thanks to the policy. Of the 437 counties in northern China, the communists managed to maintain control of just 10 of them in the face of these barbaric methods. China was not alone in its suffering. A very similar policy was implemented in Vietnam during the Japanese occupation there between 1940 and 1945. There, its targets were the communist guerrillas of the Viet Minh, and the methods were indistinguishable. Theft, intimidation, murder, and massacres were the instruments of Japanese policy. Japanese authorities seized farmland for their own use, stole cattle and crops to keep them from the communists, and even seized ownership of factories and warehouses, on the accusation that they were being used to help the guerrillas. As in China, systemic violence against civilians was used to stamp out communist support and spread terror among the people. The crime of aiding the guerrillas was punished with death, usually by firing squad. Even stealing food, which the Japanese widely interpreted as being a way to supply the guerrillas, warranted beheading. Boatmen accused of helping the communists were stabbed with bayonets and their bodies thrown into the river. In the town of Daitu, the mayor who was accused of being a communist ally was arrested, strung up by his heels, and disemboweled in public view. Although Vietnam did not officially have a three-oars policy, the logic and methods of the Japanese were virtually identical there as it was in northern China, and indeed anywhere the Japanese occupied across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Japanese surrender in August 1945 brought an end to the three-oars policy, but like so many atrocities in history, it did not bring much justice. The Tokyo war crimes trials did not do enough to account for Japanese crimes in China. Later tribunals held in China punished just 500 people and executed just under 200. An inadequate measure of justice to match the litany of crimes committed in 8 years of occupation. Among those who escaped punishment was Emperor Hirohito himself, who had personally signed off on the orders but was protected from any post-war consequences by the Americans, who worried that prosecuting him would cause unrest in Japan. The three-oars policy was thrown into public light in 1957, when a group of veterans came together to publish a scathing book about Japanese war crimes. The book was fiercely attacked by Japanese nationalists and pulled from publication soon after. Study of the policy only resumed towards the end of the 20th century, with historians now concluding that some 2.65 million civilians were killed by it. The three-oars policy is less eye-catching than the atrocities at Nanjing or the experiments of Unit 731. It is certainly less studied, at least in the West, with relatively little scholarly attention devoted to it in English, let alone popular attention. In most histories of the Second World War, it is barely a footnote, and even English-language histories of the Second Sino-Japanese War rarely devote more than a paragraph or a page to it. Despite being relatively overlooked, the three-oars policy was one of the most destructive parts of the Japanese occupation of the country. Its legacy is particularly strong in northern China and among the communists who suffered under it, and no small part of the decades-long animosity between Japan and China owes itself to those three simple instructions of loot all, burn all, and kill all. If you're interested in more about Japanese actions during the war, check out our other videos on Unit 731, Comfort Women, and the massacre at Nanjing to understand the true extent of the crimes they committed. When Equatorial Guinea achieved independence in 1968, its new beginning turned out to be the start of a nightmare that continues to this day. Hundreds of thousands of people would be driven into prisons, into exile, or into their graves at the behest of one insane man Francisco Macias Nguema. In this video, we'll show you how this deranged man turned his country into the Auschwitz of Africa. So stick around to learn about the mad dictator who dined with the dead and turned Santa Claus into an accomplice in his unspeakable crimes. And don't forget to like this video to show your support for our content. Macias had been a simple clerk and translator under Spanish rule. He was shamelessly corrupt, but his favors to the right people saw him climb the hierarchy of power. Still, anyone who knew him could tell something was wrong. Macias was egotistical and paranoid with absurd political views. During a conference on independence in Madrid in the 1960s, Macias declared that he saw Hitler as the savior of Africa and a warrior against imperialism. He also described himself as a Hitlerian Marxist, combining the economic policy of the German philosopher with the authoritarianism and ethno-nationalism of the German dictator. None of this prevented him reaching the office of Deputy Prime Minister in the transitional government set up in 1964. And when the time came to campaign for the election of Equatorial Guinea's first independent president in 1968, Macias was well placed to win. Macias channeled fierce nationalism and anti-Spanish attitudes, and appealed to voters with his aggressive and blunt rhetoric. Macias would stand on a rally stage in a town, point to a European's house, and promise voters that he'd take all European property and give it to his supporters. It was an easy sell, and in September 1968, Macias soared to victory to become the president of Equatorial Guinea. Like so many dictators before him, the first thing Macias did was eliminate threats to his power. His rival in the election, a man named Bonifacio Onduedu, was accused of coup plotting and arrested, along with a number of other officials and ministers. They were all executed or left to die in prison. They were the first to be accused of plotting against Macias, but far from the last. In February 1969, Foreign Minister Atanasio Ndongo was accused of a different coup attempt. Macias's guards cornered him in the cabinet room, where the official story claims he leapt from a window to his death. Other witnesses insisted that Macias's guards killed him, or that Macias himself threw the man from the window. Numerous others were implicated in this supposed conspiracy, including Saturnino Ibongo, the country's UN ambassador, who was recalled to the country and executed minutes after getting off the plane. Of the 12 men who made up Macias's first cabinet, only 2 would live to see his fall, and by 1971, over 2/3 of the original 1968 National Assembly had disappeared, never to be heard from again. Macias quickly allied himself to many of the other worst regimes of the world, especially the USSR, Cuba, and North Korea. He allowed Moscow to use his country to smuggle weapons to conflicts across Africa, and had 200 elite Cuban soldiers serving as advisors and personal guards. Macias even sent his daughter to be educated in North Korea, where Kim Il-sung personally supervised the girl's education. With no real opponents to speak of, it was a simple matter for Macias to secure his own power. In 1970, he outlawed all existing political parties and consolidated his own into the Partido Único Nacional de Trabajadores, PUNT. He also created a youth paramilitary force called the Juventud en Marcha con Macias, which acted as an equivalent to Hitler's Brown Shirts or Mao's Red Guards. He also stripped away the legal limits on his power, a story that will be familiar to anyone who has studied dictators before. Between 1971 and 1973, Macias assumed the powers of the legislature, executive, and judicial branches of government, made it illegal to criticize his regime, and granted himself total power to call or dismiss the National Assembly, to appoint or dismiss judges, or to order arrests and executions for any reason. This also came with an impressive suite of titles: President for Life, Head of the Nation and Party, Grand Master of Education, Science, and Culture, and his personal favorite, the unique miracle. Macias set about remaking his country to fit his delusions and eccentricities. He closed off a large part of the capital city of Malabo into a presidential zone that the public were forbidden from entering, a move equal parts vanity and paranoia. Private businesses were suppressed and foreign trade collapsed. With no real economy to speak of, the people of Equatorial Guinea were reduced to a primitive bartering system, where exploitation, theft, and starvation were commonplace. The desperate and fearful population were forced into military exercises to fulfill Macias's vision of a powerful and revolutionary nation. In 1971, all citizens were required to practice daily with wooden rifles, and from 1976, all children between 7 and 14 had to submit to mandatory military training. Any child or parent who refused his training would be imprisoned or shot. The intellectual class was a particular target of Macias's regime. Macias deeply distrusted the educated class and called them the greatest problem facing Africa today. He accused them of polluting our climate with foreign culture. Thousands of people with university degrees or skilled occupations were imprisoned or executed at his command. Western clothes, food, music, and even medicine were banned for being un-African. Doctors were especially distrusted as agents of Western medicine, and Western thinking and almost all of the country's medical professionals faced exile, a jail cell, or prison. By 1979, there were only 2 doctors left in the whole country. The church did not escape the dictator's wrath either. Macias believed missionaries and priests were imperialist agents who were corrupting the nation and turning them against the regime. In 1974, he passed a law strictly limiting all religious gatherings and ordered militiamen and party loyalists to, quote, watch the subversive activities of the Catholic and other missionaries. What little preaching that was permitted had to be pre-approved, and priests were expected to sing Macias's praises in their sermons. Eventually, all churches were legally required to display a photo of the dictator in every place of worship. Macias's persecution of religion did not stop his own religious delusions though, and in 1978, the country's official motto became, "There is no other God than Macias Nguema." For the common people of Equatorial Guinea, there was no chance of justice. By 1972, the country's judges had been purged, and all trials were conducted by party loyalists who saw disloyalty everywhere. It's no surprise that tens of thousands tried their luck by fleeing the country. As much as 25% of the country's population left as refugees into neighboring territories. Macias sent soldiers to hunt them down and bring them back, but there were so many that he could never hope to stem the tide. Officially, Macias claimed that these refugees didn't exist, and if they did, they were foreign agents trying to make him look bad. In a rare interview given to a BBC journalist, Macias claimed that the stories of refugees were smears by the Spanish government against his country. That didn't stop Macias ordering the only road leading out of the country to be covered in landmines. Nor did it stop his soldiers constructing spike pits along the border to catch unsuspecting escapees. While Macias claimed to be a leader for all of Equatorial Guinea, he was biased towards his own Fang ethnicity, and often persecuted the smaller ethnic groups within his country. For example, when the tiny Pagalu tribe faced a cholera epidemic, he cut off any medical or financial aid to them, which resulted in hundreds of deaths. He also took revenge on the inhabitants of the island of Annobon. Most of them had voted against him in 1968, so Macias ordered mass arrests that decimated the island's population. The Bubi people of Bioko faced particular persecution. Alongside imprisonment, seizure of private property, and other abuses, Macias targeted Bubi leaders to cripple their community. Pastor Torao Sikara, one of the most important Bubi chiefs, was imprisoned and died of thirst. Another leading Bubi politician named Enrique Gori Molubela was left to die of an infection after Macias's forces gouged his eyes out. Meanwhile, Edmundo Bocio Bioko, leader of the Union Bubi, mysteriously died in prison where witnesses claimed he'd been tortured and killed by Macias's soldiers. The Bubi were important because the island of Bioko was home to the country's main industry, cocoa production. The cocoa industry relied heavily on migrant laborers from Nigeria, who earned a reputation for hard work and dependability. This made the Nigerians disproportionately wealthy and a tempting target for the regime. It was easy for Macias to fan the flames of ethnic violence against a wealthy foreign minority, and dozens of Nigerians were killed in mob attacks in the early 1970s. In one case, Macias's soldiers shot 11 Nigerian nationals at the country's embassy. The Nigerian government was disgusted and saw to the evacuation of tens of thousands of their citizens by sea and air. This created a problem. As much as Macias's regime liked to persecute the Nigerians in Bubi, they needed to make up the labor shortfall for the cocoa industry. Their solution was an old one: slavery. Thousands were pressed into forced labor on cocoa plantations or farms as the country's economy faltered. Whole villages were arrested and shipped away to Bioko. In 1973, the regime's target for forced labor was 60,000 people. However, with starvation, disease, escapes, and mass imprisonment, finding that labor force was more difficult than they expected. Girls as young as 14 were pushed into service as the industry continued to collapse in the 1970s. But even this wasn't enough. Cocoa production fell to a fraction of its pre-independence level and destroyed the country's failing economy with it. Those who didn't end up on the plantations ended up in prisons. Scholars estimate that half of the country's population was arrested at one point or another over the flimsiest of charges. Even owning a cut of Spanish ham could earn you a 5-year prison sentence. Black Beach Prison was the most infamous detention center, where many more people entered than ever left. Macias filled it with political prisoners and placed his nephew, Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, in charge of prisoners. Obiang personally tortured prisoners for his own amusement, but the tiny number of survivors from the prison offer only a glimpse of the horrors they endured. One survivor described how prisoners were forced to dance around a fire for hours on end, while the guards laughed and jeered. They danced until they collapsed into the fire, at which point the guards heated iron rods in the flames and beat the prisoners until they got up, or until they were never going to rise again. Another survivor claimed to have personally seen 157 prisoners beaten to death from his cell alone. Despite the harshness of his prison system, Macias believed, or claimed to believe, that they were a source of constant unrest. Political prisoners were regularly accused of coup attempts and anti-government plots that were used to justify immediate executions. One alleged plot occurred in Bata Jail in June 1974, where 114 political prisoners had somehow contacted foreign agents and were on the verge of trying to overthrow the government. Most were killed during a supposed uprising on June 10th, and most of the rest took their own way out when they were caught. No concrete witnesses of the supposed rebellion survive. However, the regime did present confessions from the prisoners that meticulously detailed their guilt. These confessions were said to be delivered before a tribunal, despite the fact that this tribunal occurred several weeks after most of the confessors had died. As his country slid into chaos and despair, Macias fell ever further into madness. He'd always been unstable, but with no restraints on his power and total freedom to do as he pleased to anyone who displeased him, Macias's madness became unbearable. For example, when the director of the Institute of Statistics presented data that the president didn't like, Macias had the man dismembered so that he could, quote, learn how to count. When the governor of the central bank displeased him, Macias ordered him to be detained and his home village burned to the ground before the man was executed. In 1977, two villages of Embe and Ekoquete had resisted the abuses of his men, so Macias had their entire populations exterminated. He also passed a law demanding execution for anyone caught wearing glasses, and made the word intellectual illegal. Macias made some types of fishing illegal too, because he worried that people would use the fishing boats to escape. By the late 1970s, Macias trusted no one. His inner circle was made up entirely of family members, and he abandoned the capital in favor of a massified fortified estate in his home village. The estate was guarded by his loyal foreign soldiers, and he maintained a prison for 300 inmates who he would torture or execute at his leisure, often by his own hands. Hidden away in his estate, Macias practiced magic Fong rituals, where he prayed to the skulls of the dead, hoping to absorb their power. His obsession with magic went as far as necromancy. In one memorable episode, he ordered his staff to lay a table for 8 people, and then sat alone at the table for hours, claiming that he was speaking to the spirits of the dead who'd come to dinner. His most famous crime came on Christmas Eve 1969, in the National Football Stadium. Macias had 186 alleged dissidents brought into the stadium, blasted some music over the speakers, and ordered his soldiers to open fire. According to some sources, every soldier was dressed as Santa Claus for the occasion. 150 people were shot, the gunfire competing with the idyllic lyrics of Mary Hopkins' 1969 hit, "Those Were the Days, My Friend," echoing throughout the stadium. Macias had the remaining 36 men dig a hole for themselves, in which they were buried up to their necks and eaten alive by hordes of ants. After 11 years of his deranged rule, Equatorial Guinea was a mess. The government barely functioned, there was almost no money in the entire country, practically no official records were being kept, and even Macias' own bodyguards had to hunt and scavenge for food in order to survive. Only a fraction of the country had running water or electricity, and there was no effective long-distance communication within or beyond the country's borders. Large portions of the population were in prison, assuming they hadn't fled, and many more lay in unmarked graves, hastily buried by Macias' thugs. Fearing that he would be the next victim of his uncle's paranoia, Macias' sadistic nephew and former overseer of Black Beach Prison, Obiang Nguema, launched a coup in August 1979. Macias' bodyguards remained loyal at first, but soon abandoned him when they saw that Obiang had the support of practically everyone. Macias fled into the jungle with a suitcase full of cash, where he was eventually found, alone and delirious. Before he fled, he'd burned almost $100 million as petty revenge, destroying perhaps the majority of the country's cash reserves. Obiang's men captured him, and soon Macias was on trial for genocide, mass murder, embezzlement of public funds, torture of political prisoners, and burning entire villages. It was little more than a show trial. Everyone knew he was guilty. Citizens flooded into the courtroom and shouted out stories of his crimes as the trial went on. He was convicted and sent to Black Beach Prison on September 29, 1979 to be executed. After so many years of his insanity and secret occult practices, the authorities couldn't actually find native soldiers brave enough to kill him. They were scared that the mad president would haunt them beyond the grave. Instead, a group of Moroccan mercenaries were summoned and shot him just 6 hours after his sentencing. Macias joined thousands of his own victims in the graves of Black Beach Prison. In 1969, Equatorial Guinea had a population of about 280,000 people. Within 12 years, about 50,000 of them would be dead, if not 80,000. A further 25% fled as refugees, many of whom never returned. Per capita GDP fell by an estimated 90%, infant mortality soared by 60%, and life expectancy was just 30 years old. Macias turned his homeland into a nightmare and earned it the nickname of the Auschwitz of Africa, and he's been described as Africa's Pol Pot. Obiang's new regime condemned Macias, but it did not change much. Equatorial Guinea remains one of the least developed countries in the world, with an appalling record of torture, executions, and abuse. Obiang is still in power today, and continues to practice the same brutality that he learned from his work under his uncle's regime. Even Macias' daughter is still alive, and is still writing books praising the virtues of her father's monstrous regime and that of North Korea where she grew up. Macias may be dead, but the story of the horrors he and his family inflicted on his country is far from over. Hue, Vietnam, 1968. The Viet Cong went from house to house, building to building, looking for anyone on their lists. The lists contained the names of actual and suspected enemies of the people of Vietnam. When the people on the list were found, many were forced to their knees and shot in the back of the neck, at least during the first hours of the attack. Others, including the secretaries and custodial staff at newspapers, were rounded up and taken to different locations throughout the city, temporary captives. As soon as their captors had gotten together and worked out what to do with them, they were told they will be moved to a location inland and be re-educated. The lucky ones were taken to different Viet Cong camps, and some even to camps in the north, but most were told lies, taken to a wooded or isolated place within the city and clubbed to death. Some were buried alive. Most foreigners, meaning white people, who were caught were also shot. This included reporters, clerks, and minor foreign government officials. When the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were defeated after 26 days of the heaviest fighting of the Vietnam War, they left behind nearly 6,000 victims. Men, women, and children, who had been killed as enemies of the people. On January 31, 1968, the North Vietnamese Army, NV-8, and its communist South Vietnamese allies, the Viet Cong, the VC, launched the Tet Offensive, a massive attack on South Vietnamese cities, US and South Vietnamese military bases, and political centers, and much more. The now famous attack began as Vietnam was starting the New Year's holiday, or Tet, and was planned intentionally for that day when the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese believed the people of the South, along with their armed forces and those of the Americans, to be least expecting an attack, let alone one which took place throughout the country simultaneously. One of the main targets of the VC and the NVA was Hue, one of the oldest and most important cities in South Vietnam. From 1307 to 1905, the city on the Perfume River was the Vietnamese imperial capital. Even after the capital status was removed when the French took over the country in the early 20th century, Hue continued to play an important symbolic role for the Vietnamese people, and a reminder of its former independence. In 1945, after the Japanese in Vietnam surrendered, North Vietnamese leader Ho Chi Minh made Hue the capital of Vietnam again, but was forced out when the French returned in force shortly after that. In 1968, Hue was a small city of about 140,000 people. Compared to the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon, nearly 400 miles south, Hue was, and still is, a calm and dignified symbol of former greatness. In 1968, the United States would be 192 years old. Hue had been the capital of Vietnam for 400 years before the United States had become a country. For most of its history, Hue had remarkably avoided war. Since recorded history, the Vietnamese have fought the Kampucheans, Cambodians, the Cham people, who occupied a large slice of Vietnam for centuries, the Siamese, Thailand, and most often the Chinese, who were determined to make Vietnam a vassal state and frequently failed. Since the Americans had gotten involved in Vietnam during the 1960s, the war had largely stayed away from Hue. Many people considered Hue to be divinely protected or just lucky, but when its luck ran out, it ran out. The Tet holiday is a time for celebration and family, which usually spans about a week. Throughout Vietnam, people away from their family homes head back, and while Tet is a time of celebration, it's usually a relatively calm and reflective holiday. Everything about it is the opposite of war, which is precisely why the North Vietnamese launched it on the first day of the holiday season. On the 31st, thousands of Viet Cong fighters emerged from hidden bases and hideaways through the cities of South Vietnam to assault anything that they believed aided or even symbolized the South Vietnamese government and its American allies. Outside the cities, North Vietnamese soldiers and Viet Cong launched an offensive in the countryside, attacking, raiding, and sometimes seizing smaller towns and villages. This was supposed to be the first phase of the battle. The second phase, which never happened, was aimed at starting a massive popular uprising throughout South Vietnam against the corrupt government of Nguyen Van Thieu. This never happened because ultimately the communists were defeated militarily. However, in terms of morale and psychology, the Tet Offensive was an American and South Vietnamese defeat. The undetected and massive attack shocked the American military, the American political establishment, and the American public. Until then, the military, under 4-star General William Westmoreland, arguably one of the worst commanders ever sent by the United States to lead a war effort, had spent years telling President Johnson and the American people that victory in Vietnam was just around the corner, or just a matter of time, or that it could be won with just a bit more aid, etc., etc. Before the offensive, Westmoreland and the South Vietnamese Army, or ARVN, for Army of the Republic of Vietnam, had begun to receive intelligence that pointed to, at the very least, a significant amount of enemy activity on the horizon. This intelligence was either ignored or downplayed. Some of it mentioned substantial numbers of enemy troops, which should have set off alarm bells. Still, Westmoreland, his staff, and the South Vietnamese ignored it for a variety of reasons. The first and foremost being that Westmoreland believed it to be false information intentionally spread by the communists. In his mind, the numbers being suggested were not possible, but they were. The major assaults in places like Saigon and South Vietnam's second largest city, Da Nang, were beaten back within a few days, with heavy casualties on both sides. Mopping up operations in the towns and larger villages took a few weeks. Most of the VC and NVA troops who had taken part in the initial assaults simply faded into the background, retreating into the countryside to fight another day, but not in Hue. Hue was occupied for a lot of reasons. Perhaps first and foremost, a long occupation of the imperial capital would show the world, and particularly the USA, that the communists were able to not only launch a nationwide attack, but also occupy a major city. Another reason was that a large section of Hue was known as the Walled City, a citadel, a last-ditch fortified strongpoint built centuries before in case the city was attacked. Taking the city would also allow the VC and NVA to use it as a communication center to broadcast propaganda. Route 1, the main coastal supply route in South Vietnam, ran right past Hue. Cutting the road would help slow down reinforcements and supplies to the area. The Perfume River divided the city and allowed the communists to control traffic and create military choke points. Like many Vietnamese cities, much of Hue was a densely populated maze of houses, shacks, streets, and alleys, perfect for urban defense and hiding hundreds of troops and weapons. For weeks before the battle, VC troops had infiltrated and hidden within the city, and were not discovered. When the VC emerged from their hiding places and NVA troops stormed down the main streets of Hue, they were following the instructions and orders in a massive 3,500-page plan that had been worked on in the North Vietnamese capital, Hanoi, for years. The plan was broken down to include small unit actions, especially in cities like Hue. In particular, specific units were assigned to attack ARVN and US military bases, and support areas like helipads and supply depots. Others were sent into the heart of the city to attack and take over military police stations, the known offices of the South Vietnamese military intelligence, and various other secret South Vietnamese intelligence agencies, radio and TV stations, newspapers, and schools. Other units had lists of the addresses of hundreds of people who were known to be, or just believed to be, critical of the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. This information was gathered over years, and Hue, like virtually every other city in South Vietnam and most of its villages, had VC informers and North Vietnamese spies lurking about. The information was so complete that in many instances, not only were the home addresses of anti-communists known, but so were the addresses of their friends and families, making it very difficult for them to hide when they realized what was happening. What was happening, and what continued to happen for almost the entire duration of the nearly month-long battle, was mass slaughter, and how people were killed. If you've seen our videos on the My Lai Massacre, a mass killing committed by US troops, you know that the Vietnam conflict was fought on the very edges of the rules of war. Torture by both sides was commonplace, though the Americans tended to farm out their torture, giving suspects to the South Vietnamese, who had no qualms about torture making the papers. Not only was the Battle of Hue the longest and largest battle of the Vietnam War, but the city was also the site of its largest war crime. Many people will tell you that arguments or fights between family members can be some of the most savage and heartrending. For some reason, human beings seem to expect family members, or in many cases, their close community, to think like them and have similar life goals. Unfortunately, it also appears to be true that occasionally, events and emotions converge. When they do that nationally, civil war results. And any historian will tell you that civil wars are often the most brutal. The command plan for the seizure and occupation of Hue called for all enemies of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong to be either killed, jailed, or re-educated. Certain people were to be killed out of hand, especially members of the South Vietnamese government and members of anti-communist political parties. In the initial hours of the attack, the Viet Cong managed to seize control of most of the city. The US garrison in Hue was small, only a few hundred men, and the South Vietnamese garrison was not much larger, and many of the men were celebrating Tet with friends and family. Almost as soon as they arrived, people began to be rounded up. Some were told they would just be detained and not to worry. In other parts of the city, less disciplined or perhaps simply more eager, troops marched individuals or small groups to large alleyways or spaces between buildings, lined them up against the wall, and shot them. Unfortunately, that was not all. When US and South Vietnamese forces retook the city at the end of February, they discovered mass graves, bodies that had been partially covered up and ones that had simply been left where they were killed or perhaps dumped. Many of the corpses had skulls that had been battered in, likely with rifle butts, but a few personal accounts talk of VC soldiers using iron bars. In cases where the person the communists were looking for could not be found, relatives were questioned, and in several instances killed, as the VC put word that if a particular person didn't turn themselves in or were turned in, their family would be put to death, one by one. In some sections of the city, US troops found buried and partially uncovered and bound legs and arms of people who had been buried alive. All were found with a rag in their mouths, and most of the victims who were killed in this way were women. The roundups continued for almost the entire occupation, as people in hiding were discovered or the communists heard critical remarks made about how they ran the city. At the end of February, the Viet Cong and NVA fled and were killed or captured. US Marines and soldiers, along with a sizable ARVN force, finally pacified the city. And when they did, both survivors and the mass graves they continued to discover for days and even weeks afterward told the story of what the communist occupation of Hue had been like. In 1975, the North Vietnamese and their South Vietnamese allies, the Viet Cong, seized all of South Vietnam, unifying the country by force, which they had promised not to do at the Paris peace talks of the early 1970s. If you're old enough, or if you know your history, you remember the scenes of massive crowds fleeing the approach of the NVA and VC as they advanced southward towards Saigon, and the panic of the people trying to get on the last US helicopter leaving the city. That panic was in no small part caused by the fear of the massacre at Hue happening again throughout the country. And to a large degree, it did. No one was ever held to account for the massacre at Hue. The most that the still communist Vietnamese government has admitted to was that some units showed an excessive degree of revolutionary zeal that was misplaced. Today in Hue, there are no markers or memorials for the victims of the occupation. It's almost as if it never happened, and most Vietnamese in Vietnam don't know that it ever did.